Come on in, welcome to Idled Out, where we talk all things Survivor. My name is Luke, and today we're celebrating the new era by looking at the top 15 best players from Survivor 41 to Survivor 44. 72 players have played in the new era at the time of this video. So these 15 players constitute the cream of the crop of the new era. It was tough to narrow it down to just 15, so some difficult cuts were made along the way. Spoilers, JD didn't make it. I'll be ranking on a few factors. Primarily, we'll be looking at the two pillars of winning Survivor, in my opinion, the strategic and social elements. Strength in one can make up for a deficit in the other, but generally speaking, great players need both strong strategic instincts and the social capital to pull off their ideal strategic moves. Whether you're on the top of the tribe or sitting low on the totem pole, a general sense of game awareness, where you sit, and your own threat level, as well as being able to set up votes to benefit yourself as much as possible are paramount here. And I'll be weighing all of that in my rankings. Along the way, we'll do a brief overview of each player's pluses and minuses, and the good and sometimes bad moves they made along the way. I'm also not super results oriented. I don't necessarily think that the winner is the best player of the season all the time, and that will be reflected here. Finally, this is purely subjective, so feel free to let me know who I'm missing or who I'm way over or underselling. This is part 1 of my ranking, constituting numbers 15 through 6, so let's get into it. All that said, let's count down the top 15 players of Survivor's new era, part 1. At number 15 is Carla from Survivor 43. For me, Carla makes the cut here for the control she had over pre-merge Coco. Carla was aligned with everyone at one point or another, and players tripped over themselves to feed her information, often to their own detriment. Carla's early positioning truly was masterful. She was in the center of the tribe, had a tight alliance with James and Cassidy, but also gave herself options on the side with Ryan and Gio. Add in an idol in hand, not that she needed it here, and Carla had easily one of the best first halves of the new era. Unfortunately, Carla's game ran out of steam as she got deeper into the merge, and an inability to control her own threat level did her in. She ended up sending James out of the game early on, leaving her with Cassidy as her new BFF, a relationship which ultimately turned sour and hurt her game as they turned on one another. At Cody's boot, Jesse successfully scares Carla into wasting her idol, forcing her to rely on immunity wins to make it any further, which wasn't happening considering she'd injured like every limb. Carla's game kind of petered out towards the end as she repeatedly got bamboozled by Jesse and let her scant few strategic relationships with Sammy and Cassidy fall apart. But Carla still gets major points for her Boston Rob-esque control of Coco early on. And, you know, in her defense, who didn't get bamboozled by Jesse? At number 14 is Mike from Survivor 42. I struggle with ranking Mike here. On paper, he played a rock-solid strategic game, had strong social connections, and won clutch immunities. But how much of it was by accident? Considering he seemingly didn't know his own game at Final Tribal Council, I'm inclined to believe at least some. Putting that aside, Mike represents to me the ultimate intersection of old school and new school Survivor. He thrived on his social connections, but also displayed a cutthroat ability to blindside his allies out of the game the second they became a liability to him. On Vati, Mike came off as the lovable yet bumbling tribe dad, which I think was at least partially by design. Who could vote out this guy? He's an absolute teddy bear. Despite being in the majority thanks to a series of Daniel Strunk-related events, Mike lost his closest ally, Jenny, but he managed to recover gracefully by building a relationship with Hai. Mike's game really took off at the merge, however, and he took out what remained of his original tribe in a series of increasingly brutal blindsides in exchange for greener, Jonathan-sized pastures. Indeed, his ability to quickly build relationships came in clutch here, as he linked up with fellow big boy Jonathan, the two voting in lockstep the rest of the game, and Omer, who helped do some strategic heavy lifting for Mike. These social bonds came in super clutch when Drea made a play against him, with her knowledge as power. Late game mistakes really cost Mike, though. He played it safe at Final 6 and let Marianne get credit for taking out Omer. And at Final Tribal, he hung his hat on his loyalty when he was anything but. He fundamentally did not understand his own often fantastic game, and only got Jonathan's jury vote to win. Still, up until some late game fumbles, Mike was crushing Survivor 42. If he only understood how. At number 13 is Gabler from Survivor 43. How the fuck do you rank the game of Mike Gabler? If you hop into the multiverse and go into any other timeline, Gabler does not win Survivor 43. We are in the only universe in which Mike Gabler was crowned the victor of this season. And yet, here we are, our first of the 4 new era winners to appear on this list. Gabler had an unconventional game? It's pretty rare that we see a winner nearly throw in the towel on episode 1. At the time, Gabler's win over his admittedly weak fellow finalists Cassidy and Owen was a shocker. In hindsight, he played the exact type of low-key game built on solid social bonds that he needed to. Gabler successfully played the kook, endearing himself to his Baka tribe early on with his principled loyalty and earnestness. Ellie in particular would come to regret keeping Gabler around. And Ellie and Gabler feud begins brewing when Gabler learns that Ellie and Janine looked through his bag. And at Mergatory, Gabler organizes what ends up being the move of the season by whipping nearly the entire tribe into voting out his rival.
By throwing out Ellie's name, I was trying to throw out Ellie's name.
After making such a splashy move, Gabler went Gabler and laid low for a bit, emerging only when he needed to strike, taking out the biggest threat in the game, Jesse, at firemaking, and an unexpectedly strong final tribal council sealed the deal on the win. One underreported part of Gabler's game, and something I think he should get major credit for, is navigating a game where he was by far the oldest player. At the merge, the second oldest player was 15 years Gabler's junior. I think it's impressive that Gabler managed to build his social game off such a disadvantageous age gap. Overall, Gabler is easily the weakest strategic winner of the new era, but he played the exact type of game he needed to win, building sincere connections with every juror, and opening and closing his merge game with impressive eliminations of major players. Plus, he called himself Gabler. The branding alone is worthy of top 15. At number 12 is Shan from Survivor 41. Of any player on this list, Shan had probably the best and most exciting pre-merge game. Very rarely does one player have such a stranglehold over their entire original tribe. Carla's pre-merge was great. Shan's was legendary. Now, you can argue that the competition wasn't exactly stiff, but still. Reigning in Broccoli Brad is worth top 15 all its own. Shan built strong and personal relationships with, and then brutally betrayed, nearly everyone on the constantly dwindling Uwa tribe, and her guilt-tripping JD into giving her his extra vote, only to send him home right after, is one of the most cutthroat moves ever, new era or not.
When I'm up to something that I probably shouldn't be doing, I hum this song.
Shan then managed to parlay a summit visit with Liana into a position in the majority at the merge, but ultimately failed to manage her threat level, and at Final 8, most all of her allies, including Ride or Die Ricard and Dany and Deshawn, teamed up with Erica, Heather, and Xander to take her out. In hindsight, picking the strategist Ricard over the loyalist Genie may have been a bad call. Shan's game ultimately buckled under the weight of its own success, but her vice grip on Uwa pre-merge was insanely impressive. She basically implemented the buddy system and made herself everyone's buddy. At number 11 is Ricard from Survivor 41. Now, Ricard is definitely one of the best players of the new era. Just ask him.
Yeah, I just didn't think I would do so well.
Shan couldn't have done it without Ricard, and Ricard couldn't have done it without Shan. You know, it's impressive that this toxic best frenemy ship lasted until the final 8. Because as early as episode 3, Ricard and Shan are side-eyeing each other as their biggest competition and plotting against each other beneath their breath. Ricard gets points for me less for his early days on UA. I think Shan did a lot of the strategic and social heavy lifting there. But for his mid-merge breakout, a clutch immunity win at Final 8 gave Ricard the comfort of joining with Erica to target Shan without risk of blowback, allowing him to emerge from Shan's shadow and setting him and his underdog alliance of Erica, Heather, and Xander up, well, to run the endgame. However, his choice of endgame allies left him as far and away the biggest threat out front, once his plucky band of underdogs took out Dany a few rounds later, leaving Ricard in the unfortunate position of having no choice but to try to immunity his way to the final 3, which he did not. He went home at final 5. If he'd managed to mist Xander into giving him his idol in this spot, he'd be top 5 for sure. It was a rock and a hard place, but Ricard could have done more to control his threat level. That was ultimately his undoing. I'd suggest a haircut. That is just good at Survivor hair. At number 10 is Lindsay from Survivor 42. This one may be a bit of a surprise for people, but I think Lindsay is a strong player who played an old school style of game, showing that you don't necessarily need big moves to be a threat. Sometimes just being great socially, in challenges, and around camp is enough to give you win equity. Until the endgame, and do or die, which we don't talk about, Lindsay was never really at risk of going home. That's not by accident. Pre-merge, Lindsay was in the power as a key member of the Taku 4, and used that alliance at the merge to build a larger majority, insulated from any attempted blindsides thanks to her connections with Omer and Mike. Lindsay's biggest mistake is, well, there are two. One, her myopic focus on taking down Jonathan, her biggest challenge competitor, but ultimately not someone the jury thought much of. This wouldn't really be the feather in her cap she thought it would be. And two, her conservative approach at Final 6. With idol in hand, she decided not to play it on Omer, resulting in his blindside and leaving her as the biggest threat left in the game, with few allies. She went out next. No one could call Lindsay's game bold, and that was ultimately her downfall, but it was solidly built on extremely strong social connections, and was reminiscent of a game you'd see in the first 10 seasons of Survivor. She was solidly in the center of the Taku 4, which got her to the endgame without anyone ever really bringing her up as a target. You know, it actually reminds me of someone else's game from the season before. At number 9 is Dany from Survivor 41. Similar to Lindsay, I think Dany is a criminally underrated player. I think you could plop Dany in any season, in any era, with any people, and he makes the merge 99 out of 100 times. And the one time, he rolls his ankle and is medevaced or something. Like Lindsay, I think Dany's game is a solidly old school style of gameplay. Less about big moves and more about the social bonds. He and Deshawn were true ride or dies and one of the tightest alliances of the new era. On pre-merge Luvu, seemingly all roads led back to Dany, and he and Deshawn were the backbone of the tribe. Even if Luvu went full UA, you can bet he'd be the last one standing. Let's be honest though, Dany was majorly screwed by the Hourglass twist, which sent one of his numbers, Sydney, home, and his decision to cede control of the game at Final 8 by taking out Shan was probably around too early. That left him vulnerable, and at Final 6, as the last two left of the original merge majority, Dany and Deshawn had no choice but to turn on each other, and it was Dany who went home. Up until he doomed his game by joining the blindside Shan train, Dany was playing an incredibly strong old school style game where the social connections were key and threat levels were appropriately managed. Seriously, dude looks like this and managed his threat level. Don't tell me it's not possible. At number 8 is Cody from Survivor 43. Who would have thought the guy with the mullet and live-in tattooed on his butt cheeks would be such a great Survivor player?
L-I-V-I-N.
Living.
2 exclamation points and a smiley face.
Cody's social game was frankly incredible. He was the JT to Jesse's Steven, and just like JT and Steven, these two ran roughshod over the post-merge. Cody has a top 2 social game of the new era. He was beloved by everyone, which ultimately forced Jesse's hand in betraying him at Final 6. One needs only to look at episode 2 to see just how great Cody was at playing the Charmer, though. Before the second tribal, he impulsively picked up a Beware advantage, requiring him to acquire a specific bead from other players' bags to get an idol and keep his vote ahead of the second tribal council. The bead hat was absolutely a stroke of genius. That vote clinched control of Vessi for him and Jesse. At the merge, Cody and Jesse defected from a Vessi and Baka alliance to link up with the Coco players, a bold move which paid off when Coco imploded. The linchpin of Cody's game was his relationship with Jesse, a classic Survivor duo where Cody was the personable social butterfly and Jesse was the master strategist. I think Cody banked on Jesse staying loyal and going all the way to Final 3 with him, but at Final 6, Jesse voted Cody out after playing his own idol against him in one of the most brutal moves I've ever seen. With a less cerebral partner, Cody likely cakewalks to Final Tribal, where he stomps anyone he's next to. But, you know, Jesse, so he didn't. At number 7 is Carolyn from Survivor 44. It's tough to separate the Tika 3. They all needed each other in order to pull off their excellent divide and conquer merge game, and all 3 brought something unique to the table. But what impresses me most about Carolyn's game in particular is her game's constantly growing momentum and her incredible reads. Unlike so many other people in Survivor history, including some on this list, Carolyn's game improved over time as she emerged from her kooky cocoon and blossomed into a legit threat by playing so authentically herself. She was an unabashedly emotional player, and that's not a bad thing. This is not a game you could replicate, even if you wanted to. Her initial alliance with Jam Jam ended up being the most important alliance of the season, carrying both of them through a rocky pre-merge where Tika consistently lost. Despite sometimes bickering like an old married couple, they could trust each other and thus rely on one another to have their back. That's pure social play. Carolyn's authenticity helped let Jam Jam in, and vice versa. At the merge, it's kinda tough to really separate who did what with the Tika 3. They worked so well in tandem to split Soka and Ratu apart. But one move that is unequivocally Carolyn's is the idol play on Carson at Final 7. I don't care that this ultimately was not actually necessary to save Carson. It was a ballsy play to save one of her closest allies at a time when Lauren and Jamie undoubtedly should have joined Heidi and Dany to vote Atika out. Her reads and intuition throughout the season were simply off the charts. I do think if Carolyn was able to articulate the game we, the audience, saw at Final Tribal, it's a close call. She at least gets second in that scenario. But her Amanda-esque Final Tribal, where she didn't really defend her game, keeps her just shy of the top tier for me. Nevertheless, she had consistently great game intuition and was chronically underrated by her competitors. You know, speaking of Tikas. At number 6 is Jam Jam from Survivor 44. Jam Jam has the best social game in recent memory. Rarely do we see someone who can so successfully deflect actual, legitimate criticism with humor.
Well, your name was written several times, and you said you had to survive the first few tribals.
That's right.
So
I thought that was because I'm pretty.
At almost every turn, he had the players eating out of the palm of his hand, and the amount of shenanigans he could get away with without consequence was super impressive. Jam Jam's game was dependent on his early alliance with Carolyn. They were initially the two tribal outsiders until they pulled in Carson. This is where his game is probably the weakest, the pre-merge. If Sarah doesn't lose her vote and Carson sticks with Sarah and Helen, both Carolyn and Jam Jam are potentially pre-mergers. What a nightmare world that would have been. And at the swap, he just plays kinda sloppily, fracturing his relationship with Carolyn by using her as a decoy vote when he was going for Josh, which, hey, another relationship he damaged. At the merge proper, however, the Tika 3 pit Soka and Ratu against each other, allowing them to ride the wave together deep into the game. This is where Jam Jam was best. He is one of those rare players who is exceptional at playing from the bottom. He works incredibly well under pressure and can turn on the charm to get his way when his back is against the wall. A person with a worse social game would have lost Carolyn's trust at the Franny vote, but Jam Jam is just so charming and funny. Another impressive move he made was building the narrative about his game as it was happening. Players like Cassidy and Mike tried to craft a narrative about their games at Final Tribal, and the jury saw right through it. Jam Jam set up the idea that if you vote for him, you go home very early on. He made sure everyone knew it, and then he stuck to that promise. It makes one heck of a pitch at the end. The only thing keeping him out of the top 5 for me is that he went down the stretch and potentially was going Final 3 with Carson, who almost certainly beats him at the end. His misread of Carolyn as this huge jury threat when she turned out not to be, and him somewhat regularly being at significant risk as a primary or secondary target. In hindsight, they definitely should have voted him out. Thank God for our sake, they didn't. Got nothing else for ya. Come back next week when we'll look at the top 5 best Survivor players of the new era. Until next time, don't get idled out.